On a warm October night in the year 1720, somewhere off the western coast of Jamaica, a woman stood on the deck of a small sloop with a pistol in each hand and screamed at the men hiding below. The ship was called the William. It was not large, perhaps 40 feet from stem to stern, rigged for speed rather than combat, the kind of vessel a pirate chose when he wanted to flee rather than fight. On this particular night, the William was anchored near Negril Point, a finger of land reaching into the Caribbean, where the water ran shallow and green over sandy bottoms, and where a captain who knew the coastline could lose pursuers in the maze of cays and shoals. But the William was not moving. The William was not going anywhere. The William was full of drunk men, and the Royal Navy had finally come to collect. The woman on deck was perhaps 20 years old. She had red hair, though in the darkness it would have looked black, slicked with spray and smoke, and she wore the loose canvas trousers and short jacket of a common sailor. In her hands, the pistols were already discharged, useless now as anything but clubs. Somewhere behind her, another woman was reloading, working by feel in the near-total darkness, her fingers finding powder horn and ball and ramrod with the automatic precision of someone who had done this before. Around them, the crack of musket fire from the attacking ship, the thud of grappling hooks biting into wood, the shouts of men preparing to board, and below decks, where the rest of the crew had retreated, silence. Or rather, not silence. The sounds of men too drunk or too frightened to climb the ladder and fight for their lives. The woman with the red hair fired into the darkness of the hold. The ball tore through the wooden planking and struck one of the cowering pirates in the leg. She was trying to shame them into action. She was trying to make cowardice more dangerous than courage. It did not work. The second woman, darker-haired, a few years older, with the compact build of someone who had spent years pretending to be a man, stepped to her side. They stood back to back as the first boarders came over the rail. Cutlass met cutlass, a pistol discharged at close range, the muzzle flash illuminating for one frozen instant the face of a Royal Navy sailor, young and terrified, before he fell. The two women fought. They fought for minutes that must have felt like hours. They fought until the deck was slick with blood and the boarders kept coming, and there was simply no way for two people to hold a ship against a crew of determined men. They were taken alive. Their names were Bonny and Mary Red. And what happened on the deck of the William that night, two women standing and fighting while their male crewmates hid, would become one of the most enduring images in the history of piracy. Repeated in books and ballads and eventually films, a story so satisfying in its gender reversal that it has survived for 3 centuries, largely unchanged. But here is what the story does not tell you. How brief it was. How small the stage. How quickly the curtain fell. Anne and Mary sailed together as pirates for perhaps 3 months, maybe 4. The historical record is not precise enough to say with certainty. They captured a handful of vessels, fishing boats mostly, and small trading sloops carrying cargo of modest value. They never attacked a Spanish treasure galleon or a heavily armed merchantman. They never accumulated vast wealth or commanded large crews. By the standards of the golden age of piracy, they were minor figures operating at the very end of the era, taking small prizes in waters that had already been largely cleared of the great pirate fleets that once terrorized the Caribbean. And yet their names survived when the names of far more successful pirates did not. Their story was told and retold, while the stories of men who captured hundreds of ships faded into obscurity. 300 years later, Bonny and Mary Red remain among the most famous pirates in history, perhaps the most famous female pirates who ever lived, though the competition for that title is admittedly thin. The question that should interest us is not whether their legend is deserved. That is the wrong question. Legends are not distributed according to merit. The question is why these particular lives became a legend at all, and what that legend reveals about the world that made it. This is the story of two women who refused the narrow paths their societies had prepared for them, who chose violence and freedom and the open sea over the alternatives available to women in the early 18th century. It is also the story of how we know what we know about them, which is to say, the story of how their lives were transformed into a myth almost immediately after they lived them, and how that myth has been serving the needs of subsequent generations ever since. The sources for the lives of Bonny and Mary Red are remarkably thin and remarkably late, and remarkably interested in telling a particular kind of story. This should make us cautious. The primary source, the document that has shaped nearly everything written about these women for 3 centuries, is a book published in London in 1724 under the title A General History of the Pirates. The author was listed as Captain Charles Johnson, a name that appears nowhere else in the historical record and is almost certainly a pseudonym. Scholars have debated for decades whether Captain Johnson was actually Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, or some other writer with access to trial records and sailors' testimony, or perhaps a collaborative effort by multiple hands. The question remains unresolved. What is clear is that the general history is not a work of careful scholarship. It is a popular entertainment written for a London audience hungry for tales of exotic adventure and transgression. The author, whoever he was, drew on trial transcripts, newspaper accounts, and the oral testimony of sailors, but he also embellished freely, inventing dialogue and interior thoughts and dramatic scenes that no witness could have observed. The chapter on Anne Bonny and Mary Read is rich with detail that cannot possibly have come from any contemporary source. Descriptions of their childhoods, their thoughts and feelings, their conversations with each other. These details are literary inventions, not historical facts. We also have the trial records from the proceedings in Spanish Town, Jamaica in November 1720. These are terse and legalistic, as trial records tend to be. They confirm that Anne Bonny and Mary Read were tried for piracy alongside the male members of Calico Jack Rackham's crew. They confirm that both women pleaded their bellies, claimed to be pregnant, and were thereby spared immediate execution. They record the testimony of witnesses who described the women fighting on deck during the attack on the William. They do not tell us much else. Beyond these 2 sources, we have fragments, brief mentions in colonial correspondence, a notice in a Boston newspaper, the occasional reference in the records of the Admiralty courts. The material is sparse, contradictory in places, and filtered through the assumptions and interests of the men who wrote it down. Modern historians have supplemented this thin documentary record with contextual research, studies of piracy in the Caribbean, of gender and labor in the early 18th century, of the legal and social position of women in England and the colonies. Archaeologists have excavated pirate sites and examined the material culture of the era. Scholars have analyzed the general history as a literary text, tracing its sources and interrogating its methods. The result is a more nuanced and more honest picture than the one Captain Johnson painted, though it is also inevitably a more uncertain one. What we can say with confidence is limited. We know that Anne Bonny and Mary Read existed. We know they sailed with Calico Jack Rackham. We know they were captured in October 1720 and tried in November. We know they pleaded pregnancy and were not immediately hanged. We know Mary Read died in prison sometime in the spring of 1721. We know Anne Bonny's ultimate fate is unrecorded. Beyond these sparse facts, much of what we know is inference, speculation, or the invention of an 18th century author writing for an audience that wanted sensation more than accuracy. This should not discourage us from telling the story. It should make us tell it more carefully, distinguishing where we can between what is documented and what is imagined, and acknowledging that the most vivid details are often the most suspect. The story of Anne Bonny begins, if we trust the general history, which we should do cautiously, in County Cork, Ireland, sometime around the year 1700. Her father was a lawyer named William Cormac. Her mother was a maidservant in the household, a woman whose name the sources do not preserve. The affair was a scandal. In the rigid social hierarchies of early 18th century Ireland, a man of professional standing did not marry his servants, and the children of such unions carried the stain of illegitimacy, which closed doors and narrowed possibilities in ways that are difficult for modern readers to fully grasp. Cormac did not marry the maidservant, but he did something almost as damaging to his reputation. He tried to keep the child. According to the general history, he dressed the infant Anne in boy's clothing and passed her off as a relative's son, a young clerk being trained for the law. The deception held for a time, then collapsed. Whether it was the maidservant's jealousy or the suspicious observations of neighbors, or simply the difficulty of maintaining such a fiction in a small community where everyone knew everyone's business, the truth emerged. Cormac's wife discovered the affair. His practice declined. His reputation was ruined. And so, like so many others in that era, he got on a boat. The Carolina colony in the early 1700s was not yet the prosperous plantation society it would become by mid-century. It was a rough frontier, a place where a man could reinvent himself, where the rigid social categories of the old world were somewhat more permeable, where ready cash and a willingness to work counted for more than bloodline and reputation. Charleston was its principal city, a hot, swampy, malarial port that would eventually grow wealthy on rice and indigo and the labor of enslaved Africans. But in Anne's childhood was still a place of wooden buildings and muddy streets and the constant threat of Spanish raids from Florida and Indian attacks from the interior. William Cormac prospered. The sources suggest he built a plantation, acquired wealth, and established himself as a respectable member of colonial society. His daughter grew up on the edges of the planter class, close enough to taste its privileges, far enough to be marked by the irregularity of her birth. The general history describes Anne's childhood in terms that may be more literary convention than fact. She is said to have had a fierce and courageous temper, a phrase that tells us little about the actual child and much about what the author wanted readers to believe about the woman she became. She is said to have stabbed a servant girl with a knife during a quarrel. She is said to have beaten a young man who made advances toward her, leaving him bedridden. These stories may be true, or they may be the kinds of things people always say about women who later commit violence, a retrospective reading of childhood that finds omens everywhere. What seems more reliably established is her marriage to a man named James Bonny. The sources agree that this marriage occurred, that her father disapproved, and that Anne was disinherited as a consequence. James Bonny was a sailor, a young fellow who belonged to the sea, as the general history puts it, and apparently a man of no great fortune or ambition. Why Anne married him is a question the sources do not answer. Perhaps she loved him. Perhaps she wanted to escape her father's household. Perhaps she saw in this small-time sailor a path toward the sea and the wider world beyond Charleston's muddy streets. Whatever her reasons, the marriage did not last long as a functional partnership. The couple left Carolina and traveled south to New Providence in the Bahamas, and there, in that chaotic and ungoverned place, Anne's life took the turn that would make her famous. New Providence in 1718 was the closest thing the Caribbean had to a pirate republic. The island sits at the northern edge of the Bahamas archipelago, a low-lying sliver of land with a natural harbor on its northern shore. The harbor at Nassau was well protected, shallow enough to prevent large warships from entering easily, and positioned perfectly for intercepting merchant traffic moving through the Straits of Florida. For roughly a decade, it had been the unofficial capital of Caribbean piracy, home to perhaps 2,000 pirates at its peak, a place where stolen cargo could be fenced, ships could be careened and repaired, and men who had made themselves outlaws in every other port could drink and fight and spend their plunder without fear of arrest. The golden age of piracy, if such a phrase can be applied without irony to an era of violence and exploitation, was already ending when Anne Bonny arrived in the Bahamas. The great pirate captains of the previous decade were dead or scattered. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, had been killed in a battle off the coast of North Carolina in November 1718. Samuel Bellamy had drowned in a storm off Cape Cod the year before. Stady Bonnet had been hanged in Charleston. The Royal Navy was tightening its grip, and in that same year, 1718, a former privateer named Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau with a squadron of warships and a royal pardon for any pirate who would take it. Rogers' arrival marked the end of New Providence as a pirate haven. Many pirates accepted the pardon and attempted to return to lawful employment. Others fled to more remote bases in the outer Bahamas or along the Central American coast. The ones who remained, the ones who could not or would not give up the pirate life, found themselves increasingly hunted, their former sanctuary transformed into a base for the very forces that sought to destroy them. It was into this world of endings that Anne Bonny stepped. Her husband, James Bonny, appears to have been one of those marginal figures who hover around the edges of the pirate world without ever fully committing to it. The general history describes him as an informer, someone who reported on the activities of pirates to Woodes Rogers in exchange for money. Whether this is true or whether it was a detail invented to explain why Anne left him is impossible to say with certainty. What the sources agree on is that the marriage was unhappy and that Anne found her husband inadequate. What she found instead was John Rackham. He was called Calico Jack, a nickname derived from the brightly patterned calico clothing he favored. In an era when pirates often dressed in stolen finery, silk coats and silver-buckled shoes, and whatever gaudy treasures they could pull from captured cargo, Rackham's preference for colorful cotton set him apart. He was not a particularly successful pirate. He had briefly commanded a crew in 1718, before Woodes Rogers' arrival, and had accepted the royal pardon along with many others. But the legitimate opportunities available to former pirates were limited, and the pull of the old life was strong. And by 1719, Rackham had returned to piracy. Anne Bonny became his lover, and then his partner, and then a member of his crew. The transition from plantation daughter to pirate's consort was not necessarily as dramatic as it might seem. The boundaries between legal and illegal commerce in the early 18th century Caribbean were porous. Merchants traded with pirates. Colonial officials looked the other way in exchange for bribes. Sailors moved fluidly between naval service, merchant shipping, privateering, and outright piracy, depending on economic conditions and personal circumstances. The line between sailor and pirate was often a matter of opportunity and perspective. What was unusual, what made Anne Bonny noteworthy even in her own time, was that she fought. Women on pirate ships were not unheard of, though they were rare. The maritime world was intensely masculine, and the superstitions of sailors held that women aboard ship brought bad luck. Wives and lovers occasionally sailed with their husbands, though typically as passengers rather than working members of the crew. The women who appear in the pirate records are usually captives, passengers on captured vessels who were sometimes ransomed, sometimes recruited, sometimes abused, sometimes killed. Anne Bonny was none of these things. According to all the sources, she took up weapons and used them. She fired pistols and swung cutlasses. She participated in the boarding actions that were the essential tactical move of Caribbean piracy. The chaotic, close-quarters combat where a small boat of pirates swarmed onto a larger vessel and overwhelmed its crew through speed and ferocity before they could organize resistance. She wore men's clothing, perhaps for practical reasons, perhaps as disguise, perhaps both. The general history suggests that Anne's sex was known to the crew, while other sources imply she passed as a man except to those closest to her. The truth is probably situational. Disguise in the early modern period was more effective than we might imagine. Clothing did much of the work that secondary sex characteristics do today in marking gender. A woman in men's clothes, doing men's work, speaking and moving in the ways that men spoke and moved, could pass unremarked in many circumstances, particularly among people who had no reason to suspect deception. What mattered, in the end, was that Anne Bonny fought well enough to be accepted and fought well enough to be remembered. And then, on a day that the sources do not record precisely, she met Mary Red. Mary Red's story is, in some ways, even stranger than Anne Bonny's. A life of sustained impersonation that makes the modern reader wonder what it cost her, and what it gave her, to live so long behind a mask. She was born in England, probably in London, probably sometime in the early 1690s. Her mother was a woman who had been abandoned by her husband, a sailor who had gone to sea and never returned. The husband had left behind one legitimate child, a son, and when that son died in infancy, Mary's mother found herself in desperate circumstances. She was pregnant by a man who was not her missing husband, and in the social and economic structures of the time, this was catastrophic. An illegitimate child entitled a woman to nothing. The legitimate son, had he lived, could have been supported by appeals to the husband's family. But a bastard? A bastard was no one's responsibility. And so Mary's mother made a choice that would shape her daughter's entire life. She disguised the infant Mary as her dead legitimate son and presented her to her mother-in-law as the rightful heir. The grandmother, never suspecting the substitution, provided a small allowance for the child's maintenance. The deception worked. Mary Red spent her entire childhood as a boy. Try to imagine what this meant. Not a temporary disguise, not a game, but a daily, hourly performance sustained across years and years, from earliest consciousness into adolescence and beyond. Learning to walk as boys walked, learning to speak as boys spoke, learning to suppress whatever impulses might betray her, to hide whatever differences became visible as she grew. Her mother was her only confidant, the only person in the world who knew the truth, and her mother had every reason to ensure the deception continued. When Mary was old enough to work, she was placed out as a footboy, a young male servant, to a French lady. Then she went to sea aboard a man of war. Then she joined the army, enlisting as a foot soldier and eventually serving in a regiment of horse in Flanders during the War of the Spanish Succession. She was a soldier. She fought in battles. She lived in army camps among men, subject to the rough intimacies of military life, the shared quarters, the casual nakedness, the physical examinations and medical treatments that might at any moment expose her secret. And she was never discovered. Or rather, she was discovered exactly once by a man she loved. The general history tells the story in romantic terms. Mary fell in love with a handsome Flemish soldier who served in the same regiment. She revealed her sex to him. He was shocked, then delighted. They were married, though how the marriage was accomplished without exposing her disguise is a detail the sources do not explain. And when the war ended, they used their combined savings to open a small inn called the Three Horseshoes, near the town of Breda in the Netherlands. For a brief moment, Mary Red lived as a woman. She wore women's clothing. She kept house. She was, by all accounts, happy. Then her husband died. The cause is not recorded. Disease, most likely. The early 18th century was rich in diseases that could carry off a healthy young man in days or weeks. And with his death, Mary's brief respite from impersonation ended. The peace that had followed the Treaty of Utrecht meant there was no more fighting in Flanders, no demand for soldiers, no way to sustain the inn without the income a new war would bring. Mary had no family to return to, no network of support, no way to survive as a single woman in a world where women's economic options were desperately narrow. She put on men's clothes again and went back to sea. The ship that carried her toward the Caribbean was a Dutch vessel bound for the West Indies. It was captured by pirates, perhaps English pirates, perhaps the crew of Calico Jack Rackham, perhaps some other vessel whose identity the sources do not preserve. Mary joined them. Whether she chose this willingly or was pressed into service, whether she saw piracy as an opportunity or simply as survival, the sources do not say. What they agree on is that by 1720 she was sailing with Rackham's crew, still passing as a man, still maintaining the disguise that had shaped her entire existence. And there, on a small sloop somewhere in the waters around Jamaica, she met Bonny. The meeting of these two women has become one of the most retold scenes in pirate legend, and it exists in the historical record almost entirely as a literary construction. The general history describes it with the kind of romantic detail that suggests invention. Anne, believing Mary to be a handsome young man, developed a particular fondness for her. Rackham, jealous and suspicious, confronted Anne. Mary, to diffuse the situation, revealed her sex to both of them. The three reached an understanding. Life aboard the sloop continued. Whether any of this happened as described is impossible to verify. What seems clear is that Anne and Mary knew each other's secret, fought alongside each other, and formed some kind of bond, friendship, partnership, perhaps something more, in the brief months they spent together. The nature of that bond has been debated, celebrated, and speculated about for 3 centuries. The sources are silent on the intimate details, as sources from this period almost always are. What the sources do record is that Anne and Mary fought. They fought during the boarding actions that were Rackham's primary mode of piracy. They fought when the crew attacked fishing boats and small merchant vessels in the waters around Jamaica. And they fought, finally, on the night when everything ended, the night when Jonathan Barnett's sloop caught up with the William near Negril Point, and the crew was too drunk to resist, and 2 women stood on deck alone against the boarding party. The trial records from Spanish Town describe testimony that Anne and Mary were active participants in multiple piratical acts. Witnesses identified them as having handled weapons, issued threats, and behaved as full members of the crew. The witnesses may have been exaggerating, or may have had reasons to emphasize the women's participation, or may have been telling the simple truth. The court believed them. Anne Bonny and Mary Red were convicted of piracy. The sentence was death by hanging. And then, in a moment of almost theatrical timing, both women made the same declaration. They were pregnant. Under English common law, a pregnant woman could not be executed until she had given birth. The law held that the unborn child was innocent of the mother's crimes and could not be killed for them. The court ordered that both women be examined by physicians. Both were found to be pregnant, or at least pregnant enough to satisfy the legal requirement. Both were returned to prison to await the birth of their children. Mary Red never left that prison alive. She died sometime in the spring of 1721. The cause, according to the records, was a violent fever, which could have been any number of diseases that swept through the crowded, unsanitary jails of the colonial Caribbean. Whether she gave birth before she died, and if so, what happened to the child, the records do not say. Anne Bonny's fate is one of the great mysteries of pirate history. There is no record of her execution, no record of her death in prison, no record of her release or pardon. She appears in the trial records of November 1720, and then she vanishes. The General History, published just 4 years later, claims that her execution was several times respited, delayed again and again, but offers no information about her ultimate fate. She was continued in prison to the time of her being brought to bed, the author writes, and what became of her afterwards is unknown to us. Historians have speculated for centuries. The most popular theory, the one that has become almost canonical in the retelling, is that Anne's father, William Cormac, used his wealth and connections to secure her release. He had disinherited her once, the story goes, but blood proved thicker than principle. He paid bribes, pulled strings, arranged for his daughter to be quietly removed from the prison and transported back to the Carolina colony, where she lived out her days under an assumed name, married respectably, bore children, and died in obscurity. There is some circumstantial evidence for this theory. A woman named Anne Burleigh, who lived in Virginia and died in 1782, has been proposed as a candidate for the reformed Anne Bonny, though the documentary evidence is thin. Parish records and genealogical databases have been scoured for traces of a woman with the right age and background who appeared in the Carolina colonies around 1721 and lived quietly thereafter. The results are inconclusive. The alternative possibility, that Anne Bonny died in prison of fever or childbirth or simple neglect, and that the record of her death was lost or never made, is at least as plausible. Colonial record-keeping was haphazard. Prisoners died unmarked and unrecorded. The absence of evidence for her death is not evidence of her survival. What we know for certain is only this. Anne Bonny was sentenced to hang in November 1720. She pleaded pregnancy. She was returned to prison, and then the record falls silent. The story of Anne Bonny and Mary Red, as it has been told for 3 centuries, is as much a creation of the 18th century literary imagination as it is a record of historical fact. The General History transformed 2 women who lived briefly and violently at the margins of the pirate world into archetypes: the passionate red-haired rebel, the stoic soldier in disguise, and subsequent generations have elaborated on those archetypes, finding in them whatever meanings they needed to find. For 18th century readers, the story was a titillation and a warning. Transgression was exciting, but it ended badly. For 19th century readers, it was a curiosity, a footnote in the larger story of piracy and empire. For 20th century readers, and especially for readers after the feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s, it became something else entirely. A story of women refusing the constraints of patriarchal society, seizing agency through violence, and living, however briefly, on their own terms. Each generation finds in the story what it is looking for. This is what legends do. But there were also real women, behind the legend and before it. Women who were born into circumstances not of their choosing, who made decisions under constraint, who found each other somehow in the vast and violent world of the early 18th century Caribbean, who stood on a deck and fought one October night while the men they had sailed with cowered in the hold. The sources cannot tell us what they thought or felt. The sources cannot tell us what they said to each other in the quiet hours of the night watch, or how they understood the lives they were living, or whether they believed they would survive. The sources give us only the outline of events, and even that outline is partial and distorted and shaped by the interests of the men who wrote it down. What we can do is try to understand the world that made them, the structures and pressures that limited women's choices in the early 18th century, the maritime world of the Caribbean, with its particular economy and violence, the final twilight of the golden age of piracy, when the great captains were dead and the Royal Navy was closing in, and the window for a certain kind of outlaw life was rapidly shutting. Anne Bonny and Mary Red were not the most successful pirates of their era. They were not the richest or the most feared or the most destructive, but they were the ones who became a legend, and the legend has things to teach us about the making of myths, about the hunger for stories of women who transgress, about the strange alchemy by which certain lives become symbols while others are forgotten. The Caribbean of the early 1700s was a world designed to extract wealth from the earth and the bodies of the people who worked it. Understanding Anne Bonny and Mary Red requires understanding that world, its geography, its economy, its peculiar combination of rigid social hierarchy and violent disorder. The Caribbean Sea is not one thing. It is a basin of 1,000 moods, fringed by islands that rise from the water like the knuckles of a drowned giant. In the early 18th century, these islands were the scattered jewels of competing empires, Spanish, French, English, Dutch, each colony a node in a vast extractive network that reached from the sugar fields of Jamaica to the counting houses of London, from the slave markets of West Africa to the rum distilleries of Barbados. The water that connected them was warm and treacherous, stippled with reefs, crossed by currents that could carry a ship 100 miles off course in a single night. To sail these waters was to navigate not just geography but politics, because every island flew a different flag, and the flags themselves were often unreliable guides to whose law actually held. The islands were small. Jamaica, the largest English possession in the region, was roughly the size of Connecticut. Barbados could be crossed on horseback in half a day. New Providence, the island that would become Anne Bonny's gateway to piracy, was a strip of scrubland and harbor barely 20 miles long. But these small places generated enormous wealth because they had been bent entirely to the purpose of producing sugar, and sugar in the early 18th century was among the most valuable commodities on earth. To understand why sugar mattered, consider the mathematics of addiction. Before the 17th century, sweetness was a luxury in Europe. Honey was expensive, fruits were seasonal, and the taste of sugar itself was available only to the wealthy, imported at great cost from distant Mediterranean or Atlantic islands. Then, the Caribbean plantations began to produce in volume, and the price dropped. And suddenly, the ordinary people of England and France and the Netherlands could afford to sweeten their tea, their coffee, their breakfast porridge. Demand exploded. By 1700, the average English person consumed 4 pounds of sugar per year. By 1750, that number had more than doubled. By 1800, it would reach 18 pounds. The appetite was insatiable, and the Caribbean existed to feed it. The cost of that feeding was measured in human lives. Sugar cultivation was brutal work, clearing jungle, planting cane, harvesting with machetes in the tropical heat, crushing the stalks in mills that could take an arm off in an instant, boiling the juice in copper kettles that filled the air with scalding steam. Free workers would not do this labor, not in the quantities required, not for wages the planters were willing to pay. And so, the system turned to slavery, importing hundreds of thousands of African people to work and die on the sugar islands. Between 1700 and 1750, more than 1 million enslaved people were transported to the British Caribbean alone. Their average life expectancy after arrival was 7 years. This was the economy that Bonny entered when she arrived in the Bahamas. This was the world whose edges Mary Red would eventually patrol with pistol and cutlass. The pirate ship moved through a landscape saturated with violence, not the dramatic violence of naval battles and boarding actions, though that existed too, but the grinding, systemic violence of an economy built on human trafficking and forced labor. The pirates did not invent this violence. They fed on it, intercepted its profits, occasionally liberated some of its victims, but they also participated in it. Pirate crews captured slave ships and sold the human cargo. Pirate captains traded in the same ports where enslaved people were auctioned. The freedom of the pirate life existed alongside and was entangled with the unfreedom of millions. The geography of the Caribbean made piracy possible. The islands were scattered across 600,000 square miles of water, and the channels between them were too numerous to patrol. A ship leaving Jamaica for London had to thread through passages where a well-positioned sloop could intercept it without warning. The trade winds were reliable. A captain who knew them could predict where merchant vessels would pass and when. The small islands offered countless coves and inlets where a pirate could careen his ship, repair his hull, take on water, and disappear before any pursuing warship could find him. The Spanish had learned this geography first, 3 centuries earlier. The pirates learned it from them, and from the buccaneers who had raided Spanish shipping for generations. By 1700, there were men sailing those waters who knew every reef, every current, every seasonal shift in wind and weather. The harbors mattered especially. Pirates needed places to sell their stolen goods, to recruit new crew, to spend their money on the pleasures that made the life worthwhile. For a time, certain ports provided these services openly. Port Royal in Jamaica had been the most famous, a city built on pirate gold, crammed with taverns and brothels and merchants who asked no questions about the provenance of the goods they bought. An earthquake destroyed it in 1692, sending half the city sliding into the harbor, an act of divine judgment, many said, against a modern Sodom. But other ports remained: Charlestown on New Providence, the French settlements on Tortuga, the small trading posts scattered along the Central American coast, where logwood cutters and smugglers operated beyond the reach of any government. New Providence was crucial to the story of Bonny and Mary Red. The island sits at the northern end of the Bahamas, sheltered by a string of barrier islands that create a protected harbor. In the first 2 decades of the 18th century, it became the de facto capital of Caribbean piracy, a place where hundreds of pirates gathered between voyages, where stolen ships were refitted and stolen cargoes sold, where men, and a few women, who had renounced the authority of kings and governors, created something that was not quite a society, but was more than mere chaos. The Pirates of Nassau, as the settlement was called, had no formal government. They had customs, habits, practices that emerged from the nature of their work. Ships were run as rough democracies, captains were elected and could be deposed, major decisions were voted on, shares of plunder were divided according to formulas agreed in advance. This was not idealism, it was practical necessity. A pirate captain could not compel obedience the way a naval captain could not fall back on the authority of king and admiralty when his men refused an order. His power lasted only as long as his crew believed he would lead them to profit and keep them alive. The egalitarianism of the pirate ship was a solution to a management problem, not a political philosophy. But it was real nonetheless, and for men accustomed to the rigid hierarchies of naval or merchant service, where flogging was routine and captains held power of life and death, the pirate ship offered something that felt, in comparison, like freedom. This freedom was, of course, radically incomplete. The pirates were not utopians. Their articles, the written agreements that governed life aboard ship, allocated extra shares to skilled positions like quartermaster and gunner, creating hierarchies of their own. They punished theft, cowardice, and desertion with keel hauling, marooning, or death. They routinely tortured prisoners for information about hidden valuables. They participated, as mentioned, in the slave trade. The freedom they enjoyed was the freedom of the strong, the freedom to impose their will on others through superior firepower and seamanship. It was available to those who could fight and was denied to those who could not. And it was, for women, almost entirely unavailable. The pirate ship was an overwhelmingly male space. Not because there was a law against women aboard, pirate ships recognized no law but their own, but because the path to a pirate ship typically ran through the male institutions of naval service, merchant seamanship, or military desertion. Women in the early 18th century did not serve on warships. They did not apprentice on trading vessels. They did not join armies in Flanders or desert from garrison duty in the Caribbean. The skills that made a useful pirate, navigation, gunnery, sail handling, the ability to survive and fight at sea, were skills that women had almost no opportunity to acquire. The very few women who appeared aboard pirate ships almost always did so in one of two ways, as captives or in disguise. Anne, Bonny, and Mary Red represent both pathways, though neither was precisely a captive, and neither maintained her disguise for long. Anne came aboard as the lover of the captain, entering the pirate world through a romantic attachment rather than through the ranks. Mary came aboard disguised as a man, having already lived most of her life in male clothing, and was apparently accepted as a crew member before her sex was discovered. The question of how their crewmates responded to the presence of women aboard is one the sources do not satisfactorily answer. The general history presents their presence as known and accepted, at least after an initial period of disguise. Other accounts suggest there may have been tensions, that some crew members objected to sailing with women, that the presence of 2 women aboard a ship of roughly a dozen men created complications that the sources only hint at. What seems clear is that Anne and Mary were not merely tolerated but were active participants in the ship's operations, taking part in boarding actions, handling weapons, standing watches. They were pirates, not passengers. Whatever accommodations the crew made for their presence, they made them for fighters, not for women who happened to be aboard. The ship itself was small. Calico Jack Rackham operated a sloop, a single-masted vessel, fast and maneuverable, ideal for the quick strikes and rapid escapes that Caribbean piracy required. A sloop of this era would have been perhaps 40 to 60 feet long, with a crew of a dozen to perhaps 24 men. There was no privacy aboard such a vessel. The crew slept in hammocks slung in the common area, ate together, worked in constant proximity. The captain might have a small cabin at the stern, but cabin in this context means a space perhaps 8 feet by 6, shared with the ship's instruments and papers. Everyone knew everyone's business. Secrets were difficult to keep. Anne and Mary lived in this space. They ate salt pork and hardtack and whatever fresh provisions the ship's cook could acquire. They drank rum, which was safer than water in the tropical heat and which helped blur the edges of a life that was, when not punctuated by violence, often tedious. Long days of sailing, waiting, watching for a target. They handled ropes and sails and weapons. They went aloft to adjust rigging, hauled on lines to trim the sails, stood at the rail with muskets when a prize ship came into range. This was not glamorous work. It was physical labor, hard on the hands and back, performed in sun and salt spray and the constant motion of a deck that never stopped moving. When a prize was taken, the violence was sudden and brief. Most merchant ships surrendered without a fight when they saw a pirate flag. Resistance usually meant death, and the cargo was insured anyway. So what was the point? The pirates would come aboard, help themselves to whatever valuables they could find, perhaps take provisions or equipment they needed, occasionally press useful sailors into joining their crew. Then they would let the prize go or burn it or keep it if it was better than their current vessel. The actual combat, when it happened, was a matter of minutes. A boarding action, hand-to-hand fighting on a slippery deck, the discharge of pistols at close range. It was over almost before it began. Anne and Mary participated in these actions. The records of their trial include testimony from witnesses who saw them fighting, who described them wielding cutlass and pistol alongside the men. One witness testified that they wore men's jackets and long trousers, though they did not attempt to hide their sex. Another said they were more willing to fight than most of the crew. The image that emerges is of 2 women who had fully committed to the pirate life, who were not playing at it or merely accompanying a male partner, but were themselves pirates in every operational sense. The targets were modest. Rackham's crew did not take Spanish treasure galleons or East India Company merchantmen. They raided fishing boats, small trading sloops, canoes carrying goods along the Jamaican coast. The hauls were correspondingly small, some dried fish, some provisions, occasionally a bit of coin or saleable goods. This was not the piracy of legend, the capture of ships bursting with gold and silver. This was the piracy of the margins, scraping a living from the edges of the Caribbean trade. By 1720, the great age of piracy was ending. The most successful captains, Blackbeard, Black Sam Bellamy, Charles Vane, were dead or captured. The Royal Navy was patrolling in force. The governor of the Bahamas had offered pardons to pirates who surrendered and death to those who did not. The window for the outlaw life was closing, and those still practicing it were increasingly desperate, increasingly marginal, increasingly likely to end their careers at the end of a rope. Calico Jack Rackham was not a great pirate. He was a minor figure even by the standards of his time, a captain of a small crew who operated for perhaps 2 years before his capture. What made him memorable was the company he kept, the 2 women who sailed with him and who would become, paradoxically, far more famous than he ever was. The historical record suggests that Rackham was competent but not exceptional, charismatic enough to attract a crew, but not brilliant enough to keep them out of trouble. His end came stupidly, his crew drunk and unprepared when the pirate hunter found them. The women who fought while the men hid became the enduring image of that final night, a reversal of expectations that has captivated storytellers for 3 centuries. But before that end came the middle, the ordinary days of the pirate life, the hours and weeks that no one recorded, because nothing dramatic happened in them. Bonny woke on a rocking deck, felt the Caribbean sun on her face, ate whatever was available for breakfast. Mary Red climbed the rigging to adjust a sail, scanned the horizon for ships, took her turn at the helm. They talked, presumably, though we will never know what they said. They formed whatever bond developed between them, whether that bond was friendship or something more. They lived a life that was, in its daily texture, probably more boring than romantic. Long stretches of waiting punctuated by brief bursts of activity, the tedium of any job performed at sea. The geography they moved through was beautiful. The Caribbean in autumn is warm but not brutal, the hurricane season winding down, the trade wind steady. The water shifts through shades of blue, navy in the deep channels, turquoise over the sand, almost transparent in the shallows where coral heads cast shadows on the bottom. The islands rise green against the sky, fringed with white beaches, backed by mountains that catch the clouds. Flying fish break the surface and glide for impossible distances. At night, the stars are so numerous they seem to form a second ocean overhead, an inverted sea of light. This was their world, Anne and Mary's, for a few months in the autumn of 1720. A small ship, a small crew, a dangerous trade practiced in dangerous waters. They slept when they could and worked when they had to and waited for the prize that would make the voyage worthwhile. They drank rum and told stories and watched the horizon. They were outlaws, criminals, pirates, categories that meant something very specific to the governments whose ships hunted them and would mean something rather different to the storytellers who would romanticize them in the centuries to come. The coast of Jamaica stretches roughly 150 miles from east to west, its northern shore facing the open Caribbean, its southern shore sheltered by the island's mountainous spine. In October 1720, Rackham's sloop worked these waters, staying close to the coastline, intercepting small vessels, taking what they could. The pickings were slim. The merchants knew pirates were about and took precautions. The Navy was watching. Every day that passed was another day the net could close. It is worth pausing here to consider what Anne Bonny and Mary Red might have thought about their situation, insofar as the sources permit any inference at all. They were not naive. They had both lived hard lives, had both made choices that carried serious risks. Anne had abandoned her husband and her respectability, had followed a pirate captain into a life that she must have known could end at the gallows. Mary had been a soldier, had seen combat, had lived for years as a man in a world that would have punished her severely if her disguise had been discovered. These were not women who stumbled accidentally into danger. They sought it out, or at least accepted it as the price of the freedom they wanted. But they were also living in a world where their options were limited. A woman of Anne's class and background in the early 18th century, had a narrow range of socially acceptable paths: wife, mother, perhaps widow. She could not own property in her own name if married. She could not practice most professions. She could not vote, hold office, or serve on juries. Her legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. The plantation economy of the Carolina colony offered her one possible future: marriage to a wealthy man, management of a household, the supervision of enslaved laborers, the bearing of children who would inherit her husband's property. She rejected that future, whether from temperament, from circumstance, or from some combination of the two. Mary Red's options had been even narrower: born illegitimate, raised in poverty, dependent on a deception for her very survival. She had learned early that the world offered her little unless she took it for herself. Her disguise as a man was not adventure-seeking. It was necessity. Boys could find work that girls could not. Men could join armies and earn wages that women were denied. When her brief marriage ended with her husband's death, she returned to the disguise because she knew how to live in it, knew the skills it allowed her to use. The path that led her to Rackham's ship was a path of constrained choices, each decision leading to the next, until she found herself aboard a pirate vessel in the Caribbean with a cutlass in her hand. This is not to romanticize their situation or to claim that piracy was a rational response to patriarchal oppression. It was not rational. It was extremely dangerous, poorly paid compared to its risks, and almost certain to end in death or imprisonment. The women who chose it, and there were very few, were outliers, people whose circumstances or personalities made the conventional paths even more intolerable than the outlaw one. But it is also not accurate to describe their choice as mere criminality, as simple law-breaking for personal gain. The laws they broke were not neutral. The society they defied was not equitable. The constraints they escaped were real constraints, imposed by a world that offered women few chances to determine the courses of their own lives. The merchantman that became a pirate's prize, the Navy sloop that became a pirate hunter's weapon, the woman who became a pirate's crewmate, all of these transformations were made possible by the particular conditions of the early 18th century Caribbean. It was a world in flux, a world where empires competed for islands and trade routes, where fortunes were made and lost in single voyages, where the authority of distant governments was often weak enough to defy. For a brief window, perhaps 20 years on either side of 1700, that world permitted a certain kind of outlaw life to flourish. Then the window closed. The navies grew stronger. The colonial governments became more effective. The men and women who had lived outside the law found themselves hunted down one by one until the age of piracy ended, not with a dramatic final battle, but with a series of hangings and surrenders and quiet disappearances. Bonny and Mary Red lived at the very end of this window. They were among the last pirates of the Golden Age, and they were captured just as that age was ending. Their story has endured in part because of its dramatic elements: the women fighting while men cowered, the pregnancy that cheated the gallows, the mysterious disappearance that leaves the ending open. But also in part because they came at the end, because they represented the final generation of an era that was already becoming nostalgic, even as it concluded. The pirates of 1720 were already aware that their world was disappearing. The storytellers who wrote about them a few years later were already treating them as figures from a receding past. Anne and Mary became symbols of an age because they appeared at the moment when that age required symbols, when it was passing from history into legend. The night of their capture approached. The sloop lay at anchor near Negril Point, the westernmost tip of Jamaica, where the island narrows to a finger of land pointing toward the open sea. The crew had taken a prize earlier that day, had celebrated, had drunk too much rum. The captain was below, possibly with Anne, possibly simply drunk himself. The watch was lax. No one was expecting trouble. Captain Jonathan Barnett's sloop came out of the darkness with the wind behind it. The attack came without warning, as the best attacks do. Barnett had been hunting Rackham for days, working on intelligence gathered from fishermen and traders who had seen the pirate sloop moving through the waters around Jamaica. He knew roughly where to look. He knew the reputation of his quarry. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was the condition of the crew he was about to engage. The sloop that materialized from the darkness was the William, a fast vessel commissioned by Jamaica's governor specifically for the purpose of hunting pirates. Barnett commanded it with the cold efficiency of a professional. This was not personal for him. This was work. He had been given a commission, he had been promised a reward, and he intended to collect both. The romance of the pirate age meant nothing to a man like Barnett. He saw pirates the way a rat catcher sees rats, as vermin to be eliminated one at a time until the problem was solved. The first sign of trouble aboard Rackham's sloop would have been the lookout's cry, if there had been a lookout awake to give it. The sources disagree on the details of what happened next, but the broad shape is consistent across multiple accounts. Barnett's sloop closed the distance quickly. He hailed Rackham's vessel and demanded surrender. Someone aboard the pirate sloop, we do not know who, fired a shot in response. It was a foolish thing to do given the circumstances. It transformed what might have been a negotiated surrender into a military engagement, and Rackham's crew was in no condition to fight a military engagement. They were drunk. They were scattered. They were not at their battle stations. When Barnett's men opened fire with their swivel guns, sweeping the deck of the pirate sloop with grape shot, most of Rackham's crew scrambled for cover below decks rather than returning fire. This is where the legend crystallizes. This is the moment that has been retold for 300 years, the image that illustrates every account of Anne, Bonny, and Mary read. Two women standing on the deck of a sinking ship, weapons in hand, screaming at the men hiding below. The primary source for what happened that night is the account that emerged at their trial, which was based on the testimony of witnesses and the confessions of the captured pirates. According to this account, when Barnett's men boarded the sloop, they found the deck defended by only a handful of fighters. Anne and Mary were among them. The rest of the crew, including Calico Jack himself, had fled below. One of the trial witnesses testified that Anne fired her pistol into the hold where the men were hiding, calling them cowards and demanding they come up to fight. Another witness claimed that Mary did the same, killing one of her own crewmates who refused to join the defense. These accounts may be exaggerated. They may be embellished by witnesses who knew what kind of story the court wanted to hear. But even if we strip away the embellishments, what remains is striking. When the moment of crisis came, the two women fought, and most of the men did not. There are several possible explanations for this disparity. The simplest is that Anne and Mary were sober, while the rest of the crew was drunk. Women in this period, even pirate women, typically drank less than men, both because alcohol was expensive and because drunkenness in women was considered particularly shameful. If Anne and Mary had been drinking water or small beer while the men celebrated with rum, they would have been the only clear-headed people aboard when the attack came. Another possibility is that they simply had more to lose. Rackham's male crewmates, if captured, faced hanging, a bad fate, but a quick one. Anne and Mary, if their gender was discovered, faced something potentially worse, the particular degradation reserved for women who transgressed sexual and social norms, the public spectacle of their bodies examined and displayed, the knowledge that their deaths would be accompanied by a special kind of moral condemnation. For a woman in their position, surrender might have felt worse than fighting. The deck of a sloop with a cutlass in hand offered a kind of dignity that a colonial courtroom would not. A third explanation, less easily quantified but no less real, is that they were simply fighters. Not all people are. Most people, when faced with violence, will freeze or flee. A small percentage will fight. This characteristic does not correlate neatly with gender or with physical size or with social status. It is something closer to temperament, a willingness to engage rather than retreat, to meet force with force, to accept the possibility of death in exchange for the chance of victory. Both Anne and Mary had demonstrated this temperament before. Anne had reportedly stabbed a servant girl with a table knife in her youth. Mary had served in the cavalry in Flanders, had faced enemy fire, had killed men in battle. They were, whatever else they were, people who knew how to fight and who did not shy from fighting. The battle, such as it was, did not last long. Barnett's men were sober, well-armed, and numerous. They boarded the sloop, overwhelmed its few defenders, and captured the entire crew. Anne and Mary were taken alive. So was Calico Jack. So were the men who had hidden in the hold while the women fought above them. The prisoners were transported to Spanish Town, Jamaica, where they would be tried. The trial would begin in November 1720, just weeks after the capture. The machinery of colonial justice moved quickly in these matters. Pirates were not afforded the lengthy appeals and procedural delays that might slow the trial of a more respectable defendant. They were enemies of all mankind, hostis humani generis, and the law dealt with them accordingly. The voyage from Negril Point to the prison at Spanish Town would have taken several days. We do not know the conditions under which Anne and Mary were held during this journey, but we can make reasonable inferences based on standard practice. Prisoners were typically held in the hold of the transporting vessel, chained or confined in some manner to prevent escape. They would have been fed ship's rations, hard biscuit, salt meat, water, and allowed limited movement. The guards would have been vigilant, aware that they were transporting valuable prisoners whose escape would mean professional embarrassment and financial loss. For Anne, this journey must have been a time of reckoning. Everything she had built over the previous months, the freedom, the excitement, the partnership with Jack, was gone. Her future had narrowed to a single point, the courtroom in Spanish Town, where her fate would be decided by men who had every reason to make an example of her. She had gambled everything on the pirate life, and she had lost. For Mary, the reckoning would have been different. She had lived through worse than this. She had survived poverty, deception, war, and widowhood. She had reinvented herself multiple times, adapting to circumstances that would have broken a less resilient person. The capture was a setback, certainly, but Mary Red had faced setbacks before. The question was whether she could find some way to adapt again. We do not know what conversations passed between them during those days in the hold of Barnett's sloop. We do not know whether they comforted each other or blamed each other, or sat in silence contemplating their separate fates. The sources tell us almost nothing about their inner lives during this period. What we have instead is the public record, the court documents, the trial testimony, the newspaper accounts that would circulate through the colonies in the weeks that followed. Spanish Town in 1720 was the capital of Jamaica and the seat of British colonial authority on the island. It was a substantial settlement by Caribbean standards, with government buildings, a church, a prison, and the various establishments that served the colonial administration. The courthouse where Anne and Mary would be tried was a solid structure, built to project the authority and permanence of British law in a part of the world where that authority was frequently challenged. The trial of Calico Jack Rackham took place on November 16, 1720. It was a brisk affair. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The testimony of witnesses, the goods recovered from his sloop, the confessions of his crew. He was convicted within hours and sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out 2 days later, on November 18th, at Gallows Point in Port Royal. The execution of a pirate captain was a public spectacle, designed to serve as both entertainment and warning. Rackham was transported to the execution site, where a crowd had gathered to watch. He was allowed a final statement, though if he made one, the content has not been preserved, and then hanged by the neck until dead. His body was afterward placed in a gibbet, an iron cage designed to hold a corpse upright, and displayed at the entrance to the harbor as a warning to other pirates who might be contemplating a visit to Jamaican waters. The gibbeting of pirates was common practice in this period. The bodies would be left to rot, exposed to sun and rain and scavenging birds, until they had decomposed sufficiently to be unrecognizable. The purpose was not simply punishment, but deterrence. Any sailor entering the harbor would see the gibbet and understand what awaited those who chose the outlaw life. The body of Calico Jack Rackham hung in its cage at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor for months, perhaps years, a silent testimony to the fate of pirates in Jamaican waters. Anne was permitted to see Jack before his execution. The visit was brief, and according to the only account we have, not tender. The words attributed to her, "I am sorry to see you here, but if you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog," may be apocryphal, may be embellished, may be exactly what she said. We cannot know. But they have the ring of truth, the sound of someone who had risked everything alongside a partner and then watched that partner fail at the crucial moment. Whatever love had existed between Anne and Jack, whatever bond had led her to abandon her husband and take up the pirate life, it had not survived the night of the capture. By the time she stood before him in the prison at Spanish Town, she had already judged him and found him wanting. The trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Red took place on November 28th, 12 days after Rackham's conviction and 10 days after his execution. They were tried together as co-defendants charged with the same crimes: piracy, robbery, and the illegal boarding of vessels. The court records that survive give us a detailed account of the proceedings, though they tell us little about the women's demeanor or the atmosphere in the courtroom. The trial followed standard procedure for piracy cases. The charges were read, the evidence was presented. Witnesses testified to the specific acts of piracy committed by the defendants. The accused were given an opportunity to speak in their own defense. Then, the judges, a panel of commissioners appointed by the colonial governor, rendered their verdict. The evidence against Anne and Mary was as overwhelming as it had been against Rackham. Multiple witnesses testified that they had participated in the raids, had fought with weapons, had been present when prizes were taken. Some witnesses specifically identified them as the defenders who had stood on deck while the male crew hid below. This testimony, intended to establish their guilt, had the paradoxical effect of emphasizing their courage. They had done what the men had failed to do, had stood when others fled. Both women were found guilty. Both were sentenced to death by hanging. And then, in the moment that has made their story immortal, both declared themselves pregnant. The plea of pregnancy was a well-established legal procedure in English law. A woman who was pregnant could not be executed until after the birth of her child. To execute a pregnant woman was to execute an innocent along with a guilty, which even the harsh jurisprudence of the period could not countenance. The plea did not guarantee survival. The woman could still be executed after giving birth, but it bought time. In many cases, execution after childbirth was either delayed indefinitely or commuted to a lesser sentence, depending on the circumstances and the disposition of the authorities. For a woman to successfully plead her belly, she had to be examined by a panel of matrons, women of good standing appointed by the court to determine whether the pregnancy was real. The examination was invasive and degrading, conducted without privacy, the most intimate facts of a woman's body made into a matter of public record. But for Anne and Mary, it was the only path that led away from the gallows. They submitted to the examination. The matrons confirmed that both women were indeed pregnant. The question of who fathered these children has never been definitively answered. For Anne, the most likely candidate is Calico Jack himself. They had been lovers for months, and the timing is consistent with conception during their time together on the sloop. For Mary, the situation is more complicated. Some accounts suggest she had taken a lover among the pirate crew, a young sailor who had joined them during their last weeks of freedom. Others suggest that both pregnancies may have been the result of the same man, that the father was someone aboard the ship whose identity has been lost to history. There is also a darker possibility that the sources do not address directly, but that any honest account must acknowledge the women were prisoners held by armed men for several days before reaching Spanish Town. Sexual assault of female prisoners was common in this period, an unremarkable crime that rarely merited mention in official records. It is possible that one or both pregnancies resulted not from consensual relationships, but from rapes committed during their captivity. We cannot know. The silence of the sources on this question is itself a kind of evidence of what the record keepers of the period considered worth recording and what they did not. What we do know is that the plea was accepted. Anne and Mary were returned to prison to await the births of their children. The hangings that had been scheduled for them were stayed indefinitely. For the moment, they had escaped the gallows. The prison at Spanish Town was not designed for long-term incarceration. It was a holding facility, a place where prisoners were kept while awaiting trial or execution. The conditions would have been harsh by any standard: poor sanitation, inadequate food, limited light and ventilation. Disease flourished in such environments. Jail fever, what we would now recognize as typhus or typhoid, was a constant presence, killing prisoners and guards alike. Mary Red did not survive to see her child born. She died in prison in April 1721, roughly 5 months after her trial. The official cause of death was listed as fever, which almost certainly means one of the infectious diseases that spread so readily in the close quarters of colonial prisons. She was probably in the early stages of her pregnancy when the fever took her, though the exact timing is unclear. She was buried in Jamaica, in a grave whose location has been lost. The death of Mary Red is one of those endings that refuses to offer the narrative satisfaction we might want from it. She did not die gloriously in battle. She did not escape to live out her days in comfortable anonymity. She died in a cell, probably alone, probably in considerable suffering, of a disease that had nothing to do with her crimes or her courage. The woman who had reinvented herself so many times, who had survived disguise, war, widowhood, and piracy, was killed by a microbe, undone by the same conditions that killed thousands of ordinary prisoners who had committed far less remarkable crimes. There is something almost cruel in the arbitrariness of it. Mary had faced death many times and had always found a way through. On the deck of the sloop, with Barnett's men firing on her, she had stood her ground and fought. In the courtroom, facing the certainty of the gallows, she had found the plea that bought her time. But there was no fighting the fever, no plea that could save her from the disease that was spreading through the prison. She died as so many people died in that era, suddenly, inexplicably, without meaning. Anne Bonny's fate is shrouded in mystery. Unlike Mary, she does not appear in the death records of the Spanish town prison. There is no record of her execution. There is no record of her release. There is simply silence, a gap in the historical record where Anne Bonny should be. The most widely accepted theory is that her father intervened. William Cormac had disowned Anne when she married James Bonny, had cut her off from the family fortune when she defied his wishes. But she was still his daughter. He was still a wealthy man with connections throughout the Carolina colony and beyond. When Anne was sentenced to death, he may have reached out to the colonial authorities in Jamaica, may have offered money or influence in exchange for his daughter's life. This theory is plausible but unproven. We have no documents showing such an intervention, no letters or legal records confirming that William Cormac negotiated for Anne's release. What we have instead is an absence, the absence of any death record, the absence of any execution notice, the absence of Anne Bonny from the historical record after April 1721. Some historians have speculated that Anne was quietly released after the birth of her child, allowed to disappear into the general population of the colonies under an assumed name. Others suggest she may have died in prison like Mary, but that her death was simply not recorded, lost to the carelessness of colonial record-keeping. A few have proposed more dramatic theories, that she escaped, that she returned to piracy under a new identity, that she made her way back to Ireland or England to live out her days in the land of her birth. The most romantic version of the story places Anne in Virginia, married to a respectable man named Joseph Burleigh, living to the age of 82 and dying peacefully in 1782. This version has some documentary support. There are records of a woman named Anne Burleigh who lived in Virginia during this period, but the connection to Anne Bonny has never been definitively established. It may be true, it may be wishful thinking, it may be a coincidence of names that has nothing to do with the Irish pirate who terrorized the Caribbean in 1720. What we can say with certainty is that Anne Bonny disappeared from the historical record sometime in 1721, and that no one knows what happened to her afterward. This is itself a kind of ending, not a resolution, but a suspension, a question mark where a period should be. The woman who had lived so publicly, whose crimes and trials had been reported in newspapers throughout the colonies, simply vanished. In a strange way, the mystery of Anne's fate has contributed to her legend as much as anything she actually did. The confirmed death, the fever in the prison cell, the unmarked grave, is final in a way that closes off possibility. But the disappearance leaves room for imagination, for speculation, for the hope that she found some way out, some path to the ordinary life that had been denied her before she became a pirate. The absence of a death record is not evidence of survival, but it is enough to sustain the fantasy that she might have survived. And so, Anne Bonny exists in a kind of legendary limbo, neither definitively dead nor definitively alive, her story forever unfinished. The world that Anne and Mary had known did not survive them by much. The golden age of piracy, already fading when they took to the sea, was effectively over by 1730. The last of the great Caribbean pirates were hunted down and hanged. The Royal Navy established permanent patrols throughout the West Indies. The colonial governments that had once tolerated piracy as a useful counterweight to Spanish power now cooperated to suppress it as a threat to legitimate trade. The transformation was both military and ideological. The pirates of the early 18th century had benefited from a certain ambiguity about their status. They were criminals, certainly, but they were also useful, disrupting enemy commerce and providing a market for goods that the official economy could not absorb. By the 1720s, that ambiguity had resolved. Pirates were now enemies of all nations, hostis humani generis, to be destroyed wherever they were found. The men who had once been tolerated, even celebrated, were now vermin, and the governments of the Atlantic world were united in their determination to exterminate them. This shift had many causes. The growth of legitimate transatlantic trade made piracy more economically damaging than it had been. The treaties that ended the wars of the early 18th century removed the thin legal justification that had allowed privateers to slide into outright piracy. The colonial governors who had once looked the other way discovered that their own careers depended on demonstrating their commitment to law and order. And the pirates themselves, growing bolder and more numerous, had become too conspicuous to ignore. The hanging of Calico Jack Rackham and the capture of Anne, Bonny, and Mary Red were part of this larger campaign, one of dozens of pirate trials conducted throughout the Caribbean in the years between 1718 and 1725. Each hanging was a statement, a demonstration of the power of the colonial state and its willingness to use that power against those who challenged it. The gibbets that lined the harbors of the West Indies were a message written in rotting flesh. The age of piracy is over. Yet even as the pirates were being eliminated, they were already being transformed into something else. The trials themselves contributed to this transformation. The pamphlets that circulated through London and Boston and Kingston were not merely news reports. They were entertainment, structured for maximum dramatic effect, their subjects rendered as characters in a morality play that was also undeniably a species of adventure fiction. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, only 4 years after Anne and Mary's capture, devoted an entire chapter to the two women, and it was this account more than any other that fixed their images in the popular imagination. Johnson, whose true identity remains a mystery, though he may have been Daniel Defoe or someone in his circle, understood instinctively what later generations would confirm, that the story of two women living as pirates, fighting as pirates, was irresistible precisely because it violated everything the 18th century believed about female nature. The transformation from criminal to legend began, in other words, almost immediately. Before the ink was dry on the trial records, Anne, Bonny, and Mary Red were becoming myths. This was not an accident. Johnson's account was not journalism in any modern sense. It was a commercial product designed to sell copies, and he shaped his material accordingly. The women he described were larger than life, romantic figures whose courage and ferocity shamed the men around them. The detail about Anne's final words to Calico Jack, "If he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog," may be authentic, or it may be Johnson's invention. We cannot know. What we can know is that Johnson understood the power of that line, understood that it crystallized something essential about how these women would be remembered. In that single cutting dismissal, Anne becomes the moral center of her own story, the one who embodied the pirate virtues her male companions failed to uphold. The narrative that Johnson constructed has proven remarkably durable. Nearly every subsequent account of Anne and Mary's lives draws heavily on his version, often uncritically. The details he provided, Anne's red hair, her temper, her illegitimate birth, Mary's childhood disguise, her military service, her brief marriage, have been repeated so many times that they have acquired the weight of established fact, even though many of them rest on sources we cannot verify. Johnson claimed to have access to documents and oral testimonies, but we cannot examine them ourselves. We are forced to trust, or at least to rely upon, a writer whose relationship to the truth was complicated by commercial imperatives and a gift for narrative. This is the condition of all historical knowledge about pirates, but it applies with particular force to Anne and Mary. They were famous briefly, in their own time. They were written about by a master storyteller almost immediately after their capture. And then the sources more or less stop. We have Johnson's account, we have the trial records, we have a handful of contemporary newspaper reports, and we have very little else. Everything we think we know about their personalities, their motivations, their inner lives comes either from Johnson or from later writers drawing on Johnson. The Anne, Bonny, and Mary Red, who live in the popular imagination, are, in a very real sense, literary characters, constructions assembled from fragments of evidence and shaped by narrative conventions that are centuries old. This does not mean they are false. The women existed. They sailed with Rackham. They were captured, tried, and convicted. Mary Red died in prison. Anne Bonny disappeared. These facts are as solid as any facts about the early 18th century can be. But the meaning we attach to those facts, the stories we tell ourselves about who these women were and what they represented, that is another matter entirely. The legend of Anne and Mary has been built and rebuilt by every generation since their deaths, each age finding in them what it needed to find. For the 18th century, they were curiosities, monstrous exceptions to the natural order of things, women who had somehow become men in spirit, if not in body. The trial records themselves reflect this interpretation. One of the witnesses at the trial, a woman named Dorothy Thomas, who had been captured by Rackham's crew, testified that Anne and Mary wore men's jackets and long trousers and handkerchiefs tied about their heads, and that each of them had a machete and pistol in their hands. The clothing, the weapons, the visible adoption of male dress and male roles, these details were clearly significant to the court, markers of transgression that went beyond mere piracy into something more fundamental, a violation of the categories by which the world was supposed to be organized. The 19th century found different meanings in the same material. As the Romantic movement idealized pirates as rebels against bourgeois civilization, Anne and Mary became figures of wild freedom, women who had escaped the domestic prison that Victorian society was busy constructing for its daughters. They appeared in novels and plays, their stories embellished with invented romances and dramatic confrontations. The image of the red-haired Irish woman wielding a cutlass became a staple of popular illustration, always rendered with just enough erotic charge to titillate without being explicit. The 19th century loved pirates because they stood outside the rules, and it loved female pirates because they stood even further outside, doubly transgressive, violating the laws of nations and the laws of nature simultaneously. The 20th and 21st centuries have continued this process of reinterpretation. Anne and Mary have been claimed by feminists as proto-feminist icons, women who rejected the limited roles available to them and seized the freedom that men monopolized. They have been analyzed by gender theorists as case studies in the performance of masculinity, evidence that gender is not biology but behavior. They have been celebrated by LGBTQ historians as possible examples of queer identity in an era before such categories existed. The relationship between Anne and Mary, whatever its actual nature, has been read as everything from deep friendship to romantic love to sexual partnership. They have been deployed as evidence in arguments about the nature of early modern gender, the fluidity of identity in the maritime world, the possibilities that existed before the hardening of bourgeois norms. All of these interpretations contain some truth. None of them is the whole truth. The women themselves, whatever they actually thought and felt and desired, are largely inaccessible to us. We cannot interview them. We cannot read their letters, because if they wrote letters, none have survived. We cannot examine their diaries, because we do not know if they could write. We have only the external facts of their lives, the actions they took, the words attributed to them by others, the traces they left in the administrative records of a colonial empire that regarded them as criminals and curiosities. The rest is interpretation, projection, the construction of meaning from fragmentary evidence. This is not a complaint. It is simply the condition in which we find ourselves when we try to understand people who lived 3 centuries ago and left almost no direct testimony of their own experience. The best we can do is be honest about our limitations, to acknowledge that the Anne Bonny and Mary Read we discuss are necessarily composite figures, part historical reconstruction, part cultural myth, part mirror in which each generation sees what it wishes to see. What remains solid beneath all the interpretation is the simple fact of what they did. 2 women, in an age when women were supposed to be passive, domestic, obedient, took up weapons and went to sea with pirates. They did not merely tolerate the pirate life, they embraced it, participated actively in raids and battles, earned reputations for courage that impressed even their captors. When their ship was attacked, when most of their male crewmates were too drunk or too frightened to fight, they stood on deck and resisted. These are facts. They happened. Whatever meanings we choose to attach to them, the actions themselves were real, performed by real women whose names we know. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the endurance of their legend rests not on any particular interpretation, but on the irreducible fact of female violence, female courage, female refusal. Every age that has told their story has done so because that refusal resonates, because it points toward possibilities that official culture has usually worked to suppress. The specific content of the resonance changes. What the 18th century found shocking, the 21st century finds inspiring, but the underlying charge remains. Anne Bonny and Mary Read did something that women were not supposed to do. They did it publicly, dramatically, and without apology. And that fact, however it is interpreted, continues to matter. The Caribbean through which they sailed has not stopped being the Caribbean. The waters off Jamaica are still turquoise. The trade winds still blow from the northeast. The coastline, where Rackham's sloop anchored on that October night in 1720, still exists, still looks much as it must have looked when Captain Barnett's men closed in. The physical world persists, even as the human meanings projected onto it change and change again. But the world they knew is gone. The dense network of pirate havens, the corrupt officials willing to look the other way, the ambiguity about who was a privateer and who was an outlaw, all of that was swept away in the decades after their capture. The Atlantic world they inhabited was unified by the very trade routes they had parasitized, and that unified world eventually developed unified methods of suppression. The pirates were exterminated not because they were immoral, but because they were inconvenient, obstacles to the smooth functioning of an economic system that was just beginning to achieve its global reach. There is something worth contemplating in this. The world that produced Anne and Mary was itself a world in transition, neither the old chaos of the early colonial period nor the ordered empire that would follow, but something in between, a moment when the rules were still being written and exceptions were still possible. The pirates took advantage of this transitional space. They exploited the gaps between jurisdictions, the conflicts between empires, the lag between the old order's death and the new order's consolidation. They were, in a sense, creatures of the cracks, and when the cracks closed, they were crushed. Anne and Mary were the last gasp of this transitional moment, at least as far as female pirates in the Caribbean are concerned. After them, the closing of the cracks accelerated. The Royal Navy established permanent Caribbean stations. Colonial courts became more efficient. The message written in the bodies that hung from the gibbets of Port Royal and Kingston was received and understood. Piracy did not entirely disappear. It never has, and it continues in various forms even today. But it ceased to be a viable alternative economy, ceased to be a way of life that could sustain entire communities for decades at a time. The world became more orderly, more predictable, more thoroughly policed. The spaces in which Anne and Mary could exist, the spaces in which 2 women could disguise themselves as men, take up arms and sail under the black flag, became smaller and eventually vanished. This is not entirely a loss. The ordered world that replaced the pirate Caribbean was in many ways a safer world. Merchant sailors could travel the trade routes without constant fear of attack. Colonial economies could grow and develop without having their commerce raided. The violence that had characterized the early 18th century Atlantic, the casual brutality of pirates who tortured captains for entertainment, burned ships with their crews aboard, treated human beings as cargo to be bought and sold, that violence was gradually suppressed. The empire that eliminated piracy also, eventually, eliminated the legal slave trade, though not before millions of Africans had been transported across the Atlantic under conditions of horror that rivaled anything the pirates ever did. Yet, something was lost as well. The transitional moment had contained within it certain possibilities that the consolidated order foreclosed. The pirates were criminals, but they were also in their own chaotic way experimenters with governance, with distribution of wealth, with the relationship between labor and reward. The articles under which pirate crews operated were, by the standards of their time, remarkably democratic. Captains were elected and could be deposed. Plunder was divided according to agreed-upon shares. Disabled pirates received compensation from the common fund. Black sailors who joined pirate crews sometimes rose to positions of authority that would have been impossible in the legitimate navies of the time. The pirate ship, for all its violence and brutality, was also a kind of laboratory, a space where the social arrangements of the Atlantic world could be rearranged and tested. Anne and Mary participated in this experiment. The facts of their presence on Rackham's ship, their acceptance by the crew, their full participation in combat, these facts suggest that the pirate world could accommodate female agency in ways that the legitimate world could not or would not. This is not to romanticize the conditions under which they lived. Pirate ships were violent, hierarchical, often brutal places. The democracy of the articles coexisted with savage discipline for those who violated them. The freedom that pirates enjoyed was the freedom of outlaws, always shadowed by the possibility of capture and execution. And the position of women in that world was deeply anomalous. Anne and Mary were exceptions, not representatives of a general pattern. Still, they were possible. The experiment that the pirate world represented included, at least in these two cases, the possibility of female participation on something approaching equal terms. And that possibility, however limited and exceptional, was foreclosed when the pirate world was destroyed. The ordered empire that replaced it had no room for armed women on the decks of ships. The Victorian period would construct gender norms far more rigid than anything the 18th century had known, and those norms would persist in various forms until the present day. The closing of the cracks was also the closing of certain possibilities, and Anne, Bonny, and Mary Red remain as evidence that those possibilities once existed. The sea does not remember them. The Caribbean waters through which they sailed are the same waters they were 300 years ago, the same currents, the same colors, the same winds. Ships still cross the routes they traveled, though the ships are now container vessels and cruise liners rather than merchant brigs and pirate sloops. The harbors where they might have anchored have been transformed beyond recognition, the wooden wharves replaced by concrete quays, the taverns and brothels demolished and built over with hotels and government buildings. Jamaica, the island off whose coast they were captured, is now an independent nation, its economy built on tourism and bauxite rather than sugar and slavery. The British Empire that hanged Calico Jack and sentenced Anne and Mary to death no longer exists except as a constitutional fiction and a source of complicated feelings. Everything has changed, everything is different, and yet the story persists. It persists because it contains something that the changes cannot eliminate. The image of two women standing on a deck with weapons in their hands while the men around them cowered. That image, whether accurately rendered or mythologized, has a kind of irreducible power. It answers something. It speaks to a desire that is apparently constant across the centuries, the desire to see women possess the same capacity for violence, the same agency in the face of danger, the same refusal to submit that has traditionally been assigned to men. Every age that retells the story does so because it recognizes in Anne and Mary something it has been looking for, something that its own official culture often denies. The historical record, such as it is, confirms that something like this image is grounded in fact. The trial testimony, hostile though it was, acknowledged that the two women fought. The witnesses who described them in men's clothes with machetes and pistols were not trying to praise them. They were trying to emphasize the transgression, the unnaturalness of what they had witnessed. But the effect, 3 centuries later, is the opposite of what those witnesses intended. The transgression has become the virtue. The unnaturalness has become the selling point. This inversion is itself worth contemplating. What the 18th century found monstrous, we find admirable. What the trial court regarded as evidence of moral disorder, we regard as evidence of admirable courage. The values have flipped, but the facts have remained the same. Anne and Mary did what they did. Only the interpretation has changed. And the change in interpretation tells us something about ourselves, about the distance we have traveled from the world that produced the trial records and the pamphlets, about the categories and assumptions we no longer share with our ancestors. Whether this represents progress or merely difference is a question I cannot answer. The 21st century is not objectively better than the 18th, though it is different in ways that matter. The expansion of possibilities for women, the opening, however incomplete, of careers and freedoms that were once monopolized by men, is something most of us would affirm. But the affirmation does not require us to believe that our own age has finally understood the truth that previous ages missed. Every generation believes it has finally achieved moral clarity. Every generation, looking back, finds its predecessors benighted. And every generation is, in turn, judged by its successors. Anne and Mary will outlast our interpretations just as they have outlasted all previous interpretations. The facts of their lives will remain the same while the meanings attached to those facts continue to shift. Future generations will find in them what they need to find, and the woman with the cutlass on the deck will remain an image available for reinterpretation, a mirror that reflects whatever each age brings to it. The silence of the archives is not a barrier to this process. It is, in a way, its enabler. If we knew more about who Anne and Mary really were, if we had their letters and diaries and the intimate testimony of their own voices, we might be forced to confront the gap between the women and the myths. Their humanity might get in the way of their iconography. But we do not have those sources. We have only fragments. A birth record that may or may not belong to Anne, a trial transcript, a few contemporary accounts, a chapter in Captain Johnson's sensationalized history. The gaps in the record are filled by imagination, and imagination fills them according to its own needs. Mary Red died in that Jamaican prison in April of 1721. The fever that killed her was probably some tropical illness against which her English body had no defense. Malaria, perhaps, or typhoid, or one of the dozen other pathogens that haunted the colonial Caribbean and killed European newcomers in appalling numbers. She was probably buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on the prison grounds or in a pauper's cemetery nearby. No monument marks her resting place. No one knows exactly where her bones lie. Anne Bonny vanished into the administrative silence that followed her reprieve from execution. The records simply stopped speaking about her. This absence has generated more speculation than Mary's confirmed death. The theories about her father securing her release, about her return to Charlestown, about the children she may have borne, about the long life she may have lived under another name. But speculation is not knowledge. The absence remains an absence, and Anne Bonny exists, finally, only as a name, a handful of attributed actions, and an image that has been reproduced and reimagined for 300 years. The Caribbean that swallowed their stories continued turning beneath the same sun, indifferent to the names that would later be carved into its history. The waters off Negril Point still catch the light at certain hours in a way that transforms them into hammered copper, and the trade winds still blow from the northeast across Jamaica's northern coast, carrying the same salt and the same promise of elsewhere that Anne and Mary must have tasted in their final free hours. The physical world persists. The human meanings we attach to it do not. In the years immediately following the trial, the executions, and Anne's disappearance into archival silence, the story of the two women pirates began its long journey from event to anecdote to legend. The first vehicle for this transformation was print. Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, just 3 years after Mary Red's death, devoted substantial attention to Anne and Mary, presenting their stories in a form that would become the template for nearly all subsequent retellings. Johnson, whose true identity remains disputed, understood something essential about his audience. They wanted pirates who were colorful, dangerous, and just transgressive enough to thrill without truly threatening. Anne and Mary fit the formula perfectly. They were transgressive in a way that could be contained by narrative, made safe by distance, transformed from real women into characters in a story that always ended the same way. Johnson's account established the details that would become canonical: the meeting on Rackham's ship, Anne's initial attraction to Mary, believing her to be a handsome young man, the revelation of Mary's sex, and the bond that formed between them afterward, the battle at Negro Point where the two women fought while the men cowered below, the famous line attributed to Anne at Rackham's hanging. Johnson may have invented some of these details, embellished others, and misunderstood still more. We cannot know. His sources, like so many things about this story, are lost to us. But his version became the version, the text from which all subsequent tellings descended. Every painting of Anne Bonny with her cutlass, every novel featuring Mary Red in masculine disguise, every film and play and children's book traces its lineage back to those pages published in London 3 years after the events they describe. The printing press is a peculiar instrument of immortality. It freezes a moment, a version, a particular arrangement of words and meanings, and then replicates that arrangement across time and space until the copy becomes indistinguishable from the original, until the telling becomes the thing told. Anne and Mary as they existed in the flesh. Whatever anxieties they harbored, whatever private thoughts they never spoke aloud, whatever complexities and contradictions made them human rather than legendary, those women are gone beyond recovery. What remains is the printed version, the characters in the story, the figures that emerged from Johnson's narrative machine and have been running ever since, powered by the engine of retelling that transforms all history eventually into a form of fiction. The 18th century continued after them. The golden age of piracy guttered out like a candle in a rising wind. The Royal Navy, grown more capable and more motivated, hunted down the remaining pirate captains one by one. The colonial governors who had once tolerated or even encouraged piracy as a useful form of irregular warfare against Spanish commerce now found that tolerance politically untenable. The merchants whose ships were being plundered lobbied for protection, and protection came in the form of hanging ropes and naval patrols and the slow, steady assertion of state power over waters that had once been lawless. By the 1730s, the Caribbean pirate, that figure who had terrorized and fascinated the Atlantic world for a generation, was largely extinct as a species. The survivors scattered. Some accepted pardons and attempted to reintegrate into legitimate society. Others fled to Madagascar or the coast of Africa, seeking waters where European naval power had not yet reached. Most simply died by violence or disease or the accumulated damage of lives lived hard and fast and without regard for tomorrow. The world that Anne and Mary had briefly inhabited closed behind them like water closing over a sinking ship. The taverns of New Providence continued to serve rum, but the clientele changed. The docks of Port Royal continued to creak under the weight of commerce, but the commerce was increasingly legitimate, increasingly regulated, increasingly integrated into the vast machinery of empire that was transforming the Atlantic world. Sugar and slaves, not pirate gold, would define the Caribbean's next century. The plantation system, with its relentless demand for African labor and its brutal extraction of wealth from human bodies, would reshape the islands into something the pirates of 1720 would barely have recognized. The freedom of the sea, such as it was, gave way to the bondage of the land. The autonomy of the pirate ship, with its articles and its votes and its rough democracy, gave way to the hierarchy of the sugar estate, with its overseers and its whips and its calculated cruelties. This transition was already underway when Anne and Mary sailed with Rackham. The golden age of piracy was not ended by the Royal Navy alone. It was ended by economics, by the consolidation of colonial power, by the emergence of a stable enough political order that merchants could reasonably expect their cargoes to reach port. Piracy thrives in chaos, in the gaps between competing jurisdictions, in the spaces where law is not yet solidified. As those gaps closed, the pirates found themselves with fewer places to hide, fewer markets for their plunder, fewer options for survival. The same Atlantic system that had created them, the system of colonial extraction and triangular trade and competing European empires, eventually grew organized enough to destroy them. Anne and Mary, then, were not simply pirates. They were among the last pirates of a particular era, witnesses to the end of something that would never return in quite the same form. The pirates of the Caribbean, for all their violence and their criminality, represented a kind of alternative to the emerging order. A rough, brutal, often terrible alternative, but an alternative nonetheless. They lived outside the law in ways that most people could not, and that outsider status gave them a certain freedom that the law-abiding could only imagine. The appeal of the pirate, across centuries and cultures, stems in part from this freedom, this refusal of ordinary constraints, this willingness to live by codes of one's own making rather than codes imposed from above. The freedom was always partial and compromised and purchased at terrible cost. The pirates of the Caribbean were not romantic rebels against an unjust system. They were participants in that system, beneficiaries of the slave trade when convenient, perpetrators of violence against vulnerable people, opportunists who took what they could because they could take it. The freedom they enjoyed was freedom for themselves, not freedom for their victims. Mary Red and Anne Bonny, for all their appeal to modern sensibilities, were complicit in the same crimes as their male counterparts. They stole from merchants who had committed no offense against them. They threatened violence against people whose only fault was being in the wrong place with valuable cargo. They participated in a form of organized theft that, however colorful in retrospect, was simply crime at the time it was committed. This is the uncomfortable truth that romantic readings of piracy tend to elide. The pirates were not proto-socialists or early advocates of egalitarian democracy, though some historians have tried to read them that way. They were criminals whose brief period of success depended on specific historical circumstances that allowed them to operate with impunity. When those circumstances changed, they were hunted down and killed, as criminals typically are when the state becomes capable of suppressing them. The admiration we feel for Anne and Mary, the thrill we take in their defiance of gender norms, should be held alongside the recognition that their defiance was enacted through violence against innocent people. They were not freedom fighters. They were outlaws. The distinction matters. Yet the distinction does not exhaust the meaning of their lives. Anne and Mary existed in a world that offered women vanishingly few options for autonomy. The constraints they faced were not abstractions. They were concrete realities enforced by law, by custom, by violence. A woman in the early 18th century could not own property in her own name in most jurisdictions. She could not vote, could not serve on juries, could not enter most professions. She was legally subordinate to her father until marriage and to her husband afterward. Her body was not her own. It belonged in various ways to the men who controlled her life. Against this background, the decision to take up arms and live outside the law takes on a different character. It was not simply criminality. It was also a form of escape, a desperate grasping after freedoms that the legitimate world would not provide. The pirate ship, for all its dangers and deprivations, offered something that respectable society did not, a space where the usual rules were suspended, where skill and courage might count for more than gender or birth. The accounts we have of Anne and Mary suggest that they were valued by their crewmates for their fighting ability, that they earned their place through competence rather than mere tolerance. This is a significant detail worth pausing over. The pirates of Rackham's crew apparently accepted these women as functional members of their enterprise. They fought alongside them, took orders from them in battle, shared the risks and rewards of the pirates' trade with them. Whatever limitations the pirates may have had as moral exemplars, they were apparently capable of recognizing ability in unexpected places. The question of whether Anne and Mary were lovers has tantalized historians and readers for 3 centuries. The sources are silent on this point, which is itself significant. Johnson's account and the trial records that preceded it describe the women as intimate companions, but do not explicitly suggest a sexual relationship. This absence has been read various ways by various readers. Some see it as euphemism, as a polite silence covering something that could not be spoken directly in 18th century print. Others see it as evidence that the relationship was not sexual, that the bond between Anne and Mary was one of friendship and solidarity rather than romantic love. Still others point out that the categories themselves, friendship, romance, sexuality, may not map neatly onto the 18th century, that the ways we organize human relationships today may not correspond to the ways they were organized 300 years ago. The honest answer is that we do not know. We cannot know. The evidence does not exist, and speculation, however satisfying, is not evidence. Anne and Mary may have been lovers in the physical sense. They may have been devoted friends who never touched each other romantically. They may have had a relationship that our categories cannot adequately describe. The silence of the archives preserves all possibilities while confirming none. What we can say is that their bond was significant enough to be remarked upon by contemporaries, that they chose each other's company in circumstances where they might have chosen otherwise, that they stood together in the final battle when the men around them fled. Whether this constitutes evidence of romantic love depends on what one means by romantic love, and that is a question the sources cannot answer. The visual iconography that would come to surround Anne and Mary began to develop almost immediately after Johnson's book appeared. Engravings accompanied the text, showing the two women in poses that emphasized both their femininity and their martial prowess. Anne is typically depicted with her shirt partly open, revealing enough of her body to signal her womanhood, while her cutlass and pistol signal her dangerousness. Mary is often shown in a more masculine stance, her gender less immediately apparent, the disguise that shaped her life partially maintained, even in images meant to reveal her. These depictions established a visual vocabulary that persists to this day. The female pirate, as an image, is almost always rendered in this combination of the martial and the erotic, the threatening and the available. The combination is not accidental. It reflects the way patriarchal cultures have historically processed the threat posed by armed women, by sexualizing them, by containing their danger within a framework of male desire. The woman with the sword can be frightening, but if she is also beautiful, if she is also available to the male gaze, then her threat is mitigated, domesticated, made safe for consumption. The images of Anne and Mary that have circulated for 3 centuries participate in this dynamic. They are images of dangerous women, but they are also images of attractive women, and the attraction is never entirely separable from the danger. This is the bargain that the culture has struck with the female warrior. She can be powerful, but she must also be desirable. She can be threatening, but she must also be contained within the frame of male fantasy. Anne and Mary themselves had no control over this process. They made choices during their brief time as pirates, choices about how to dress, how to fight, how to present themselves to the world. But they did not make choices about how they would be represented after their capture and death. The images we inherit are images made by men for audiences that were predominantly male in a culture that understood women primarily as objects of male attention. The agency that Anne and Mary exercised in life was stripped from them in representation. They became characters in stories told by others, figures in pictures drawn by others, meanings assigned by others to serve purposes that had nothing to do with who they actually were. This is the fate of all historical figures to some extent. The famous dead belong to the living, who use them as the living see fit. But the appropriation is particularly acute in the case of figures like Anne and Mary, whose actual lives were so brief and so poorly documented that the appropriation has almost nothing to resist. There is no substantial body of their own words to serve as a corrective. There are no letters, no diaries, no recorded statements beyond a few lines attributed to them in Johnson's account and the trial records. The women themselves have been almost entirely erased. What remains is a name, an image, and an endless series of projections. The 19th century found Anne and Mary primarily through the lens of Victorian fascination with the exotic and the transgressive. They appeared in adventure novels and historical romances, their stories retold with the addition of whatever details the authors thought would appeal to their readers. The rougher edges were sometimes smoothed away, the violence was sometimes glamorized, the ambiguity of their actual lives was sometimes resolved into cleaner narratives of rebellion or redemption. Victorian women, constrained by codes of propriety even more rigid in some ways than those of the 18th century, may have found in Anne and Mary a fantasy of liberation that their own circumstances did not permit. But the fantasy was always safely contained in the past, in the distant Caribbean, in a world that no longer existed and therefore posed no threat to the present order. The 20th century brought new interpretations. As feminism emerged as a political movement and then as an academic discipline, Anne and Mary were claimed as proto-feminists, as early examples of women who refused to accept the roles assigned to them by patriarchy. This reading has considerable appeal, and it is not entirely without foundation. Anne and Mary did refuse those roles. They did take up arms. They did live for a time outside the constraints that bound most women of their era. But the feminist reading, like all readings, imposes contemporary categories on historical subjects. Anne and Mary did not have access to the vocabulary of feminism. They could not have articulated their choices in terms of gender equality or women's liberation. They acted from motives that are now lost to us. And while those motives may have included something like a desire for freedom from gender constraints, they may also have included simpler or less admirable things: greed, adventure, love, desperation. The late 20th and early 21st centuries added new layers to the interpretive palimpsest. Queer readings of Anne and Mary emerged, emphasizing the possibility of their romantic relationship and the gender fluidity implicit in Mary's lifelong practice of masculine disguise. These readings placed Anne and Mary within a genealogy of queer historical figures, ancestors of contemporary LGBTQ identities. The appeal of this reading is obvious. It provides historical depth to identities that are often accused of being modern inventions, evidence that people like us have always existed. But the reading carries the same risks as the feminist interpretation. It imposes contemporary categories on subjects who did not have access to those categories, who may not have understood themselves in the terms we use to understand them. Mary Red spent most of her life dressed as a man. This is a fact. What the fact means is another matter. Did Mary experience her male clothing as a disguise, a necessary stratagem for survival in a world that would not allow her to do the things she wanted to do as a woman? Or did she experience it as an expression of something deeper, a gender identity that we might today describe as transgender or non-binary? The sources do not tell us. They cannot tell us. The inner life of Mary Red is as inaccessible to us as the inner life of any historical figure whose testimony has not survived. We project onto that blank space whatever we need to find there, and the projection tells us more about ourselves than about Mary. The waters of the Caribbean continue their ancient circulation regardless of these interpretive struggles. The Gulf Stream still carries warm water northward along the coast of Florida, bending eastward toward Europe in the great conveyor belt that has shaped Atlantic climate for millennia. The hurricanes still form off the coast of Africa each summer and fall, spinning westward across the ocean to devastate whatever lies in their path. The coral reefs that once sheltered pirate ships now shelter different organisms, bleached and stressed by warming waters, remnants of an ecosystem that may not survive the century. The world that Anne and Mary knew is not merely changed, it is being erased by forces they could not have imagined, by a species-level catastrophe that makes the depredations of 18th century pirates look almost quaint. Against this backdrop, the question of what Anne and Mary meant, what they mean, what they might come to mean, takes on a certain poignancy. We argue about interpretations while the stage on which their drama unfolded transforms into something unrecognizable. The Jamaica of 1720 no longer exists. The Jamaica of 2020 will not exist in another century. The stories persist, while the places that generated them are swallowed by time and change and the rising sea. Perhaps this is why we cling so fiercely to the stories. They offer the illusion of permanence in a world where nothing is permanent. Anne and Mary, fixed in their moment by the accident of historical preservation, become anchors against the current of change. We can return to them again and again and find them always the same cutlasses, the same defiance, the same fatal courage on the deck of a sloop off Negril Point. The interpretation may shift, but the image remains. The woman with the sword remains. The figure standing when others cowered remains. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the function of figures like Anne and Mary is not to teach us lessons about our own time, not to serve as symbols of progress or regression, not to validate our contemporary values or indict our contemporary failings. Perhaps their function is simply to remain, to persist, to be available for contemplation across the centuries that separate us from them. The human past is not a repository of wisdom or a cautionary tale or a source of inspiration. It is simply the past, the long sequence of events and persons that preceded us, the accumulated sediment of human experience on which we stand. Anne and Mary are part of that sediment. They existed, they acted, they suffered, they died, and their traces remain in the archive for anyone who cares to look. The looking itself is a form of remembrance, a way of honoring the dead by attending to the fragments they left behind. We cannot know Anne and Mary. We cannot understand them in the full complexity of their humanity, but we can remember that they were human, that they lived and breathed and made choices and faced consequences, that they were not merely symbols or icons or characters, but people who once occupied space in the same world we occupy now. This remembrance does not require us to admire them or condemn them. It requires only that we acknowledge their existence, their reality, their claim on our attention as fellow human beings who happen to live 3 centuries before us. The morning of November 28, 1720, dawned gray over Spanish Town. A light rain had fallen during the night, leaving the streets slicked and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and horse manure. The prisoners would have felt the dampness in their cells at the old prison, would have heard the guards stirring earlier than usual, would have known from the unusual activity that something significant was about to happen. Calico Jack Rackham was already dead. He had been executed 10 days earlier, on November 18th, at Gallows Point in Port Royal. The hanging itself had been routine. The drop, the struggle, the eventual stillness that came to all men who met the rope. What followed was less routine. His body had been taken down, coated in tar to slow decomposition, and placed in an iron cage called a gibbet. The cage was then hung from a wooden post at the entrance to the harbor, positioned so that every ship entering or leaving Port Royal would pass directly beneath it. There, John Rackham remained, swinging slowly in the wind, his tarred flesh darkening in the sun, his empty eye sockets staring out at the waters he had once sailed. The display was meant as a warning. Piracy led here, to this swinging cage, to this slow public rotting. The message was clear, and it was brutal, and it was, in its way, effective. The golden age of Caribbean piracy was ending, and the authorities wanted every sailor, every fisherman, every merchant captain to understand that the old freedoms were gone forever. Anne and Mary did not witness Jack's execution. They remained in their cells, awaiting their own fate, their bellies beginning to swell with the pregnancies that had saved them from the immediate rope. What Anne thought as she lay in that damp cell, knowing that Jack was dead, knowing that his body was being displayed like a trophy at the harbor mouth, this we cannot know. The famous line attributed to her that she was sorry to see him there, but if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog, may be apocryphal. It appears in Captain Johnson's General History, written 4 years after the fact, and Johnson was never present at these events. He may have invented the line, or he may have heard it from someone who was there, or he may have embellished a genuine statement into something more dramatic. We cannot know. What we can know is that the sentiment, whether spoken or invented, captured something real about the relationship between courage and survival, between action and consequence. That defined the pirate world. The trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Red took place on November 28, 1720, at the courthouse in Spanish Town. They were tried together under the same indictment that had condemned the rest of Rackham's crew, the charge of piratical practices against His Majesty's subjects. The court was presided over by Sir Nicholas Laws, the governor of Jamaica. a man who had made the suppression of piracy one of the central projects of his administration. The courthouse would have been crowded that morning. The trial of two female pirates was a spectacle that drew onlookers from across the island, men and women who wanted to see for themselves these unnatural creatures who had dressed as men and fought with cutlasses and terrorized the shipping lanes. The witnesses against them were their former shipmates, men who had already been condemned and had nothing left to lose by testifying. Thomas Dillon, a mariner whose canoe had been taken by Rackham's crew in Dry Harbor Bay. John Besneck and Peter Cornelian, former members of the pirate crew who described seeing Anne and Mary in battle. Dorothy Thomas, a woman who had been aboard a captured vessel and who testified that Anne and Mary had been wearing men's clothing with handkerchiefs tied around their heads, and that each of them had a machete and pistol in their hands, and that they cursed and swore at the men to murder her. The testimony was damning and detailed. Whatever sympathy the court might have felt for two women caught up in a man's criminal enterprise evaporated in the face of witnesses describing their active, enthusiastic participation in violence. The verdict was inevitable: guilty of piracy. The sentence was death by hanging. And then came the moment that saved them, or at least delayed their deaths. When asked if they had anything to say in their defense, both women pleaded their bellies. They declared themselves pregnant. Under English common law, a pregnant woman could not be executed until after she had given birth, the reasoning being that the unborn child was innocent of the mother's crime and could not be killed for it. The court appointed a panel of matrons to examine the prisoners and verify their claims. The examinations confirmed what Anne and Mary had stated. Both women were indeed pregnant. The executions were stayed. Anne and Mary were returned to their cells to await either the birth of their children or the intervention of some other fate. For Mary Red, that other fate came swiftly and terribly. The prison conditions in Spanish Town were brutal, even by the standards of the age. The cells were cramped and poorly ventilated. Disease was endemic. The water was often contaminated, the food barely adequate to sustain life. For a pregnant woman already weakened by months of hard living at sea, by the trauma of battle and capture and trial, the prison was essentially a death sentence delivered by different means than the rope. Mary Read died in prison in April of 1721, approximately 5 months after her trial. The official cause of death was listed as fever, which could have meant any number of ailments: typhoid, malaria, dysentery, puerperal fever if she died in childbirth or shortly after. The records do not specify. What the records do show is that she was buried on April 28, 1721, in the cemetery of St. Catherine's Parish. There is no record of what happened to her child, whether it was born alive and died with her, whether it survived and was given to someone's care, whether she miscarried before reaching term. The silence of the archive swallows these details whole. Mary Red was perhaps 25 years old when she died. She had spent her entire life disguised as something she was not, first as a boy to secure her family's income, then as a soldier in Flanders, then as a sailor, then as a pirate. Whether this disguise represented liberation or constraint, self-realization or self-denial, depends entirely on how we choose to read her silence. She left no diary, no letters, no testimony beyond what was recorded at her trial. The woman behind the disguise remains invisible to us, glimpsed only in fragments: the brief marriage to the Flemish soldier, the reported romances aboard Rackham's sloop, the moments of violence witnessed by terrified captives. She lived disguised, she died in prison, and she was buried in a cemetery that has long since been swallowed by the expanding city of Spanish Town. There is no marker, no monument, no way to visit her grave and stand where she lies. And Anne Bonny? Anne Bonny vanishes. This is one of the great mysteries of the pirate age, one that has tantalized historians and storytellers for 3 centuries. The records that meticulously document her arrest, her trial, her conviction, her pregnancy, these same records fall completely silent on the question of her ultimate fate. There is no execution record, there is no death certificate, there is no burial entry, there is no release documentation. Anne Bonny simply ceases to appear in the historical record after April of 1721, the same month Mary Red died. The theories about what happened to her are numerous, and none of them can be definitively confirmed or rejected. The most popular theory holds that her father, William Cormac, used his considerable wealth and influence to secure her release. Cormac had disowned Anne when she married James Bonny, but a father's affection does not always follow the dictates of his pride. Perhaps faced with the prospect of his daughter dying in a Jamaican prison, Cormac reached out to old connections, called in old debts, bribed the officials who held her. Perhaps Anne was quietly released and returned to the Carolina colony under an assumed name, where she might have lived out her days in respectable obscurity. Some researchers have tried to identify Anne with a woman named Anne Burleigh, who married a Joseph Burleigh in Charlestown around 1721, and who bore 8 children and lived until approximately 1782. The timing is suggestive, the location is plausible, but the evidence is circumstantial at best. We want this story to be true. We want Anne to have escaped, to have lived a long life, to have watched her children grow and her grandchildren be born, to have died an old woman with her secrets intact. Whether it is actually true is a different question. Other theories are less hopeful. Perhaps Anne died in prison like Mary, her death simply going unrecorded or recorded in documents that have since been lost. Perhaps she was quietly executed after giving birth, the hanging proceeding without fanfare or documentation. Perhaps she died in childbirth, her body buried without ceremony in a prison yard that no longer exists. The silence of the archive can conceal death as easily as it can conceal survival. What we can say with certainty is that Anne Bonny, whatever became of her physical self, became something far larger than a mere person. She became a story, a legend, a symbol, an icon. The woman who might have died at 21 or might have lived to 80. Either way, she would be eclipsed by the figure she became in the cultural imagination. The years immediately following the trial saw the publication of the text that would shape how Anne and Mary were remembered. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates first appeared in 1724, just 4 years after the events at Negril Point. The identity of Captain Johnson has been debated for centuries. Some scholars have argued he was Daniel Defoe writing under a pseudonym, others that he was a genuine former sailor with direct knowledge of the pirate world, still others that he was some combination of multiple authors working from various sources. What matters for our purposes is not who Johnson was, but what he wrote. Johnson dedicated an entire chapter to Anne Bonny and Mary Red, placing them alongside the most notorious pirates of the age: Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Charles Vane, Samuel Bellamy. He told their stories with a combination of factual detail and romantic embellishment that would prove irresistible to later generations. The image of 2 women fighting on deck while their male crewmates cowered below, this image comes from Johnson, and whether it is strictly accurate or somewhat exaggerated, it is proved indelible. Johnson described their courage, their fierceness, their refusal to conform to the expectations of their sex. He made them heroes, but he also made them cautionary tales. The general history was not merely entertainment, it was also a moral document, warning readers about the wages of sin and the inevitability of divine justice. Anne and Mary may have been brave, but they were also criminals who came to bad ends. The message was clear. Piracy led to the gibbet, regardless of one's sex or one's courage. Johnson wanted his readers to be thrilled by these women, but he also wanted them to understand that such lives ended badly. This double function, titillation and moral instruction, would define how Anne and Mary were remembered for the next 2 centuries. They appeared in popular ballads and broadsides throughout the 18th century, their story simplified into verses that could be sung in taverns and marketplaces. They appeared in cheap chapbooks, their adventures condensed into a few dozen pages of thrilling narrative. They appeared in plays, their dialogues invented by playwrights who had never been near Jamaica and would not have known a cutlass from a carving knife. The real women, whatever they had been, were gradually obscured by layers of fiction and interpretation. The 19th century discovered them anew. The Romantic movement's fascination with outlaws and rebels made figures like Anne and Mary newly attractive. They fit neatly into the Romantic aesthetic of the noble outlaw, the individual who refuses the constraints of corrupt society and lives by their own code. Victorian adventure novelists plundered the pirate past for material, and Anne and Mary provided particularly rich pickings. Female pirates offered exotic novelty that male pirates could not match. Robert Louis Stevenson did not write about them directly in Treasure Island, but their shadow hangs over the book, as it does over the entire genre of pirate fiction that emerged in that era. The 20th century reimagined them again, first as subjects for historical research, then as feminist icons, then as queer icons, then as all of these simultaneously. The political meanings attached to them shifted with each generation's concerns. Were they proto-feminists, women who refused patriarchal constraint and claimed agency in a world that denied it to their sex? Were they gender nonconformists, people who found in cross-dressing a form of identity expression that their society could not otherwise accommodate? Were they working-class rebels, casualties of an economic system that offered women few options beyond servitude and sexual exploitation? Were they simply criminals, individuals who chose violence and theft over honest labor? Each interpretation tells us something about the people doing the interpreting, about what they need to find in the past, about what they hope the past might validate in their present. The physical world that Anne and Mary knew has been transformed almost beyond recognition. The Jamaica they raided no longer exists, replaced by a modern island nation that bears the scars of colonialism even as it struggles toward its own future. The harbor at Port Royal, where Calico Jack's tarred corpse swung in its gibbet, silted up centuries ago, the old pirate haven becoming a sleepy fishing village, then a naval station, then simply a place where tourists come to see the ruins of a notorious past. An earthquake in 1692 had already destroyed much of the original town before Anne and Mary were born, sending entire blocks sliding into the sea, earning Port Royal a reputation as the wickedest city in Christendom, punished by God for its sins. What remained was rebuilt, but never regained its former infamy. Spanish Town, where the trial took place, is now a shadow of its former self, the old colonial capital eclipsed by Kingston, its courthouse still standing, but surrounded by a city that has grown and changed beyond anything the 18th century could have imagined. The cell where Anne and Mary awaited their fates no longer exists. The cemetery where Mary Red was buried has been lost to time and development. The traces are gone, or so fragmentary as to be almost meaningless. What remains is the story. And the story, however embellished, however mediated by centuries of retelling, however freighted with meanings its protagonists could never have intended, points back to something that actually happened. In the autumn of 1720, two women sailed on a pirate ship in the Caribbean. They wore men's clothes, they carried weapons, they participated in attacks on merchant vessels, they were captured, tried, and convicted. One died in prison, the other vanished into historical silence. These facts are sparse, but they are real. They form the bedrock beneath all the interpretations, the irreducible core of truth around which the legend has accreted. Anne Bonny existed. Mary Red existed. They made choices that placed them outside the law, outside the boundaries their society had drawn for women, outside everything that was expected and permitted. Whether those choices represented liberation or self-destruction, whether they should be celebrated or mourned, whether they offer lessons for our own time, these are questions the past cannot answer. The past simply happened. It does not instruct, it does not warn, it does not validate, it simply was. The Caribbean waters continue their ancient movements. The currents that carried Rackham's sloop carry other vessels now. Container ships and cruise liners, fishing boats and pleasure craft, the flotillas of the modern economy replacing the galleons and merchantmen of the colonial age. The trade winds still blow from the northeast, pushing ships westward as they have pushed ships for millennia. The hurricanes still form and spin and devastate, their fury unchanged by human interpretation. And somewhere in those waters, if we allow ourselves a moment of imagination that the historical record neither permits nor forbids, there might be a trace. Not a ghost, not a presence, but something simpler, a pattern in the wave, a particular quality of light on the water at sunset, a configuration of cloud and current that for just an instant suggests the shape of a sail. The imagination reaches toward such images because the archive cannot satisfy it. We want more than the records provide. We want to see them, Anne and Mary, standing on a deck with cutlasses in their hands, the wind catching their hair, the sun blazing on the water around them. We want to know what they felt, what they thought, what they dreamed in those months of freedom before the capture and the trial and the prison and the silence. We cannot know. The distance is too great. The sources are too sparse. The human beings behind the legend remain stubbornly invisible, glimpsed only in fragments, reconstructed only through speculation. But perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps figures like Anne and Mary should remain somewhat mysterious, their inner lives protected from our interpretive demands. They owed us nothing, not their stories, not their motivations, not access to their secrets. They lived their lives for their own reasons, reasons that were sufficient for them and that do not require our approval or understanding. The fact that their stories survived is an accident of historical preservation, not a gift they intended to give us. We receive what the archive happened to preserve, and we make of it what we will. The morning of the capture, October 22nd, 1720, came after a night of drinking. This detail persists in every account, this image of a crew too drunk to fight, too besotted to man the guns when Captain Barnett's sloop bore down on them. And standing on the deck, while their crewmates hid below, two women with weapons in their hands, ready to fight and die for a freedom the world would not let them keep. They fought. They lost. They were taken in chains to Jamaica. Mary Red died in prison 5 months later. Her body lies somewhere beneath the streets of Spanish Town, unmarked, forgotten, one more anonymous grave in an island full of anonymous graves. And Bonny vanished, into death or into life, into the scaffold or into obscurity, we cannot say. The records fail. The story ends without ending. 3 centuries pass. The world changes, utterly and irrevocably. Empires rise and fall. Slavery is abolished. The Caribbean transforms from a colonial battleground into a patchwork of struggling nations. The sea itself begins to change, warming and acidifying, its chemistry altered by the accumulated exhaust of human industry. And still the story persists. Still people tell it, write about it, make films and novels and television shows about it, argue about what it means and who has the right to claim it. Anne Bonny and Mary Red, dead for 300 years, remain alive in the only way the dead can remain alive, through the attention of the living, through the ongoing act of remembrance and interpretation. Perhaps that is the only immortality available to any of us. Not the survival of the body, which is temporary, not the survival of the soul, which is a matter of faith, but the survival of the story, the persistence of the trace, the continued existence in the minds of people not yet born when we ourselves were breathing. Anne and Mary achieved this immortality. Though they could not have sought it or expected it, they made choices that caught the attention of their contemporaries. A writer 4 years later put their story in a book. The book survived. 3 centuries of readers found the story worth repeating. It was enough. The wind still blows across the Caribbean. The waves still break on Jamaican shores. The current still flows northward through the Straits of Florida, carrying warm water toward Europe, carrying nothing that remembers Anne Bonny or Mary Red. The ocean has no memory. It does not preserve or honor or forget. It simply continues, vast and indifferent, the same water that touched their hulls, the same salt spray that dried on their faces, the same horizon that bounded their vision in the last autumn of their freedom. 2 women on a ship in the autumn of 1720, 2 cutlasses catching the Caribbean light, 2 voices calling to their cowering crewmates to come up and fight. That is what remains. That is what we have. The sea took everything else.